Hey crew, a short video today about sit bone width. Sorry, I said I was gonna bring my microphone the next time I did one of the YouTube videos and I forgot my microphone, so we're doing the best we can. It'll all work out. As long as you can hear me, we're good. And I get a lot of questions about sit bone width. I have written articles about this in the past, although my blog is currently not active on my website, working on that. But I just want to talk for a moment about this topic because it's quite common. And while the big red S gave us many wonderful things in our reality of bike fitting, there's some things they gave us that were less wonderful. And one of them was a very superficial understanding of the sits bones or sit bones, depending on who you talk to, right? So this colloquialism is referring to the ischial tuberosities, which are two bony prominences on the underside of your ischium, which you can think of as the bottom of your pelvis, right? And the ischium are kind of like rocking chair feet. They're wide in the back and they're slightly curved and they get narrower in the front. So they come together in the front. That's why saddles are, generally speaking, triangular in shape. They go right along this curve here. And the ischial tuberosities would normally hit the saddle somewhere back in here, right? Somewhere in this area. And different people will have different shapes to their ischial tuberosities. Bio-individuality rules everything in bike fitting, and that's just the way it is. So some people will really have very pointy ischial tuberosities that poke down. And if they have a saddle that's too convex in that area, such as this one right in here, they would kind of fight with that convex shape, especially in this model in particular, because this has a carbon base. So this one's pretty unforgiving. But if someone has a less pronounced ischial tuberosity, they might find the curve of that saddle quite nice. For someone who's got a more pronounced ischial tuberosity or bony prominence, tuberosity just means, we'll say, pointy part. They might enjoy a saddle like this one that's got a little allowance for that. They might also select a saddle with more padding, which could work, but generally padding is a bit of a gasket. It's a one-size-fits-all solution that tends to cause problems, in my experience. Saddles for high-performance riders, saddles with a lot of padding will cause bouncing and chafing. And if the shell shape matches the shape of your pelvis, then we've got a good fit and you need and want less padding. Remember, you've got probably 12 or 15 millimeters of padding on your butt already because you're wearing a chamois. That's assuming you're wearing a chamois. So here's the plot. Today I got a question from a client, and I'm going to read it to you. I'll not read his name. SMP saddle choice is the subject. Message: Hi Colby, my sit bones are 110 millimeters. Which SMP would be the best bet? Whoop, wait. It's really hard to read an email when your computer goes to sleep. Wake up, silly computer, it's not nap time. My sit bones are 110 millimeters. Which SMP would be the best bet? I think there's supposed to be a question mark at the end of that. I know the sit bone width isn't everything. Indeed, it's not. But I'm curious on your input. I see the F20C is 135 millimeters wide, but do you know the width of the dips where your sit bones are supposed to sit? Yes, I do. I've read online you should add 20 millimeters to your sit bone width for your saddle. So I'd be looking for 130 millimeter wide saddle. Not sure if you agree with this air quotes rule or actual quotes rule. Thanks for this. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's check it out. We're gonna get our handy measuring device here, and we're gonna get our Enduro Bearings bearing caliper. So tidy. I should have opened this up earlier, but here we go. And we're gonna bust this guy out and see how wide. Look at that precision of that digital measuring device. Thank you, Enduro Bearings. Best bearings on the market. Go buy some, people. You want to forget about your stuff forever and just have shit that works? That's your jam. Hope I'm not making you dizzy by wandering around with this thing. So here's our F20C SI. And yep, overall width, call that, about 135. That looks right. And center to center, these ischial tuberosity depressions, I would say they're about 70 millimeters approximately. I don't know if you can see that from the shadow or the way this camera angle is or not. Maybe you can from the light, but Yeah, I think that's about right. Here, if we use our gauge, maybe a little less. Well, there I'm getting about 65 mils, something like that. Yep. So there's our answer. But here's the thing about pelvic width, right? And sit bone width. Sit bone width is the equivalent of going to a car dealership and telling the dealer you're interested in buying a car and them saying to you, okay, you're going to buy this one. It's a V8. And you going, cool, that's what I wanted. But obviously there are problems with this. If you go to a car dealership and pay $50,000 for a car based on the information that it's a V8, there are a lot of things you don't know. You have no idea whether it's a 2-door or a 4-door or a pickup. You don't know if it's all-wheel drive or front-wheel drive. You don't know what color it is. You don't know who makes it. So that's the equivalent of going to a bike fitter and telling them my sit bone width is 114 because all these saddles match different pelvises, and there are probably 50 different things that impact the way a human being sits on a saddle. So when I go to sit on this saddle, I have a very different experience than someone else who may have the exact same distance between their ischial tuberosities than me. For starters, we don't only sit on our ischial tuberosities. When we sit on the saddle, we sit in different postures, and the entire ischium, the entire underside of the bones, will contact the saddle if the saddle's set up correctly. So that means you're contacting the saddle at the ischial tuberosities and also forward of that all the way up to the two frontmost bones, or rather the two frontmost bony prominences, which are called the ischiopubic rami, right? And so when you select a saddle that's matching the bony architecture of the underside of your pelvis, we have to consider the relative angle of the pelvis, right? So if you have let's say you have a pelvis that's narrow in the front that matches this, but the angle doesn't match, it goes out to the side like this, you might be falling off the side in the back. And that might mean that when you rotate your pelvis anterior, the saddle feels quite good, but when you roll back, you feel like you're falling off from side to side or it's unstable. That would be just one thing in relation to the bones, right? But also there's the curve of the ischium. In my experience, some people have ischium that are very curved, and they might do better on a saddle with a deep curve, such as this, or such as the Infinity, perhaps, which is probably the deepest curved saddle on the market. But someone who has very flat ischium and not very much curve to them might do better on a saddle with a lot less curve, something flatter like this. Because when we put them on a really curved saddle, they might feel like they're always either hitting in the front or hitting in the back, right? And that leads to challenge for us. So we have the sit bone width alone will tell us nothing about the curve or the angle between the two ischium, right? Is it wider set or narrower set? It just tells us the distance between 2 points. But maybe more relevantly, we can also understand that sit bone width discussion won't account for, whoops, sorry, that was loud. This high-tech stuff here. I'm gonna show you my iPad. It doesn't account for the soft tissue structure or the nerves underneath the pelvis, right? So see these muscles here, like the iliococcygeus, right? Or the anal sphincter, or the deep transverse perineal. These muscles, or rather the tone of these muscles, will really influence how someone sits on a saddle. If somebody has incredibly high pelvic tone, then a saddle that's really stiff or rigid might feel good to them because it might match that tone. Conversely, if it's incredibly high, they might need something a little more forgiving to give them a little compliance. And vice versa. If somebody has very low pelvic tone, they might really struggle to sit on a saddle that's very rigid because it might feel super hard to them. If you have tissue that doesn't have a lot of tone or tension in it, sitting on a saddle that's very hard might be too rigid in contrast to your own bodily experience. Likewise, if you have a low pelvic tone, or if you have really, we'll say, not great pelvic floor or core control, deep core control, being the inner unit of muscles that stabilize the trunk under load, especially unilateral load experienced in cycling, then we might experience some challenges. So we have to consider that the tone of the pelvic floor will probably influence the relationship with the saddle. We also have to integrate or consider whether some people might have nerve entrapment in this area, right? So you can see how many nerves there are here. This is the posterior femoral cutaneous nerve. And on my other guy here, we can see pelvic circulation, nervous system here. And you can see how many nerves there are in this area of the body. So, sorry, camera view. So let's see if I can actually get this to show the right nerve. There's the perineal nerve, right? And we can see there in blue how that you're going to sit pretty much right on that nerve in many saddle designs. So it depends a lot on the posture of the athlete, the tone of their pelvic floor, and whether some of these nerves are inflamed or pissed off, right? Nerves tend to get pretty angry when we entrap them or when we put pressure on them for too long. Sometimes there can be an adaptation to nervous system tissue and it can respond okay to having new points of pressure put on it, but sometimes less so. And when things get really angry, it can become quite challenging to deal with that. Then we have things like pelvic trauma, pelvic floor trauma, or sexual trauma that can influence your relationship with the saddle. And this is sad, but true. We have to consider this. When we are riding a bike, we're sitting on our pelvic floor, and the pelvic floor it's a very deep and sensitive tissue in the body for a lot of obvious reasons. It's an area of sexual energy, and it's also an energy of, we'll say, very primal importance. It's associated with safety in the world. So if you had a childhood in which you were not safe, or you felt challenged to feel safe in your life, then sitting on your pelvic floor in a bike seat might present some problems for you. So we have to consider this in the relationship of the athlete and the saddle. And it's not to say that bike fitters should go asking probing questions about pelvic trauma. Sorry, probing, bad adjective. But we shouldn't step outside of our lane. I'm not suggesting that I'm a sexual trauma specialist or that any bike fitter necessarily should enter into that world. But if we suspect or deduce that a client does have trauma to their pelvic area that is influencing their relationship with the bike, then there's a time to refer out to someone else and ask if they need help. Send our clients the best help we can give them. So these are just some of the other variables that can impact your choice in saddle selection besides sit bone width. And some of you are probably thinking, well, Pearce, why don't you just get one of those pressure mapping systems and put people on that? And that is another lens to look at the relationship of the rider to the pelvis, or to the saddle rather, the rider's pelvis to the saddle. And it's possibly a route that could solve some problems or lead to some insights. That said, in my experience, that tool is unnecessary. I've had a lot of riders come through my door and leave with ideal saddle solutions, at least as far as I know. I would say they're ideal based on the fact that their comfort went way up. They stopped dealing with unnecessary comfort in saddles, and they also had long-term success with that saddle solution. So I would consider that to be a final solution in that case. And so I did that without a pressure mapping system. My method's really simple. I try a whole bunch of saddles. I put them on a test bike back to back, and I ask them how they feel. And this can be a little uncomfortable sometimes because riders don't like to talk about their stuff, specifically their down there stuff. But I just hold safe space for them and let them talk honestly. And I make it clear that I'm here to learn from their experience and help them. And when they feel safe in my presence, then they're more likely to open up about this stuff, even if it's a bit sensitive. And that's my job, is to hold safe space for the client, right? Remember, as bike fitters, we don't actually fix things. We allow people space for healing. That's a really important distinction. Just as a coach doesn't actually make a rider fast, you help the rider by giving them the proper space to train themselves. and express their athletic potential. Big difference there. Huge difference between that and I fixed riders, or I created a training program that made someone fast. I'm not responsible for other people's healing. I just make space for it. So that may seem like semantics or like I'm nitpicking, and I am, because it's really important to use precise language. So sit bone myth don't mean nothing to me. What means something to me is when you come in and I put you on several different saddle options and I ask you how you feel. And the beauty of that process is that it's just like when you go to the paint store and you're trying to pick white paint, right? So here I have my super awesome orange peel wall with white paint on it. And if I wanted to go to the store and pick white, when I walked into the paint store initially, I would see a bunch of white paint and they would all look white. But if you stare at all the whites for about 3 minutes, 5 minutes, suddenly this magical thing happens. All this subtlety comes out in the colors. One white will look very pink, another will look very rose, another will look very green. The green tint suddenly jumps out at you, and the differences are actually quite astounding. And once you see those, you can't unsee them, right? One is purple, one is green, one is rose. As an example, the exact same thing happens with saddles. When you try a saddle at first, you're like, whatever, it feels like a saddle, maybe it's a little better, I can't tell. But as we sit on several saddles back to back, we begin to tease out the differences. And sometimes this takes a few rounds. Sometimes this takes a bit of coaching for me to really tease out what the essence of what they're feeling is. And that's important to do. But it's a critical process. And that's only stage one. Stage two is then you take a test saddle. If it's an SMP, it comes in this awesome ketchup and mustard looking color scheme. And you may notice how it is embroidered on there. It says 4 test. They're Italian, so they use the number 4. It's very clever. And when they do that, then we get this beautiful outcome where you get to go test your saddle for a couple weeks in the wild. You ride it on your normal rides. You go up your climbs and down your descents, and you do the group rides, and you confirm or deny whether this saddle is actually a good fit for you. The step one is trying a whole bunch of saddles and using process of elimination and logic to figure out which may be the best possible option for you to test. Step two is you go test it. Step three is sometimes we go back to step one because the one you tested didn't work. But step 3.5 is this one's great. Now I need a retail one. And usually the test saddles that I offer people are on the less padded side, the bonier side of the spectrum. That allows them to tease these things out more quickly, right? And then sometimes people find the shell shape that they want or the width that they want, and then they select more padding. That is specific to the SMP lineup, but of course, there's a million different saddles on the market, and some of them work for different people. We have our Jelus here, right? This might work for some people, it might not for others. This is a very firm saddle, although it's it's not as firm as it looks because there is some flex built into it. For some people, the specialized saddles work really well, especially with Mimic. In my experience, Mimic tends to be highly polarizing for women. It's either, wow, I never believed a saddle could be that comfortable before, or get that thing away from me. So this is a great saddle to try if you're a woman, because the answer is usually quite clear and comes quite quickly. And then once you know, you know. And for the women, that's a final solution, then excellent. You'll usually know pretty quickly on that. The last thing I'll say regarding saddles is there is still a prevalent belief system in sport. It's part of our grade school programming. We were programmed with lots of beliefs in grade school. You could even use the word brainwashed if you were maybe feeling a bit conspiracy theorist in your mindset. I've used this word before. And we were programmed at a young age to believe certain things. For example, you should get vitamin D in your diet so that you grow strong bones. And the best source of vitamin D is pasteurized, homogenized, industrially produced cow's milk. That's a belief we were all programmed with. Another one is, in the 80s, we were programmed with the belief that you should not eat steak because if you do, you're going to drop dead of a heart attack tomorrow. and that all steak is bad for you, especially the stuff with fat in it. So these are two examples. Another one that's more relevant to the saddle discussion is the idea that all suffering is good and goes in the same box. So specifically, well, in the arena of sports, all suffering is good. And how we were programmed with this was the idea that in the gym, if you took weight training class or gym class of some variety, you were told at one point or another that you had to fail on the last rep of every set, otherwise you would not gain muscle. And for the record, this is completely false. There are lots of ways to gain both strength and muscle size without failing on the last rep. That is a very narrow bandwidth of what's possible in the gym, a very narrow perspective, and it's false. There are lots of ways around this problem. The bigger issue, though, is that I think a lot of people have extrapolated this idea into all sports, including endurance sports. And in case you were wondering, most of the intensity that we train in endurance sports, like cycling, is and can and should be sub-maximal by nature. And failure at the last rep of every set is maximal by definition. So let's think about this for a second. If you actually failed during an endurance ride, that would mean that you cramped and passed out a kilometer from your house and you had to either walk home or get a ride home or an Uber home. That doesn't happen very often, right? That would be failure. That's the strict definition. Now, you could also say that if you bonked, that was a form of failure, and that does happen sometimes. But in the strictest sense, that would be failure. And this is also obviously incorrect. When you think about it logically, it doesn't make any sense at all. What's my point? Why are we talking about this and how does it relate to saddles? Well, people believe that all suffering is constructive in sports and that failure is part of that model. And these two beliefs are intertwined in my experience. So when we're talking about failure in sports and being suffering as the way to pass through that portal of approval and love, what we're talking about is the acceptance that all suffering is good. So you go on a 100-mile bike ride, and in that box of suffering goes painful legs because I rode 100 miles, and painful lungs because I went really hard on a climb and my chest hurts and my lungs hurt, or I felt a sense of real aerobic strain during those hard moments in that ride, or maybe after the ride, or during the end of the ride, the last hour of the ride. Those are normal parts of suffering that we expect when we train hard, when we do a ride that pushes our boundaries, right? But in that same box, we also put, oh, my feet fell asleep or my feet hurt because my shoes are the wrong size, but that's just all pain. It goes in the same box. And my junk is asleep, or my ass is on fire, or my penis is numb, or my labia hurt because my saddle is incorrect. That's just part of cycling. And it's part of riding a bike seat, so I should just suck it up and deal with it. It's all suffering, and over a long enough timeline, I'll figure it out. And this is completely incorrect. The same thing could be said of hand numbness, extreme shoulder pain, or any shoulder pain really. Any extreme pain on the bike that isn't inflicted by your own internal dosing of intensity should not be tolerated, especially saddle discomfort. If you're having numbness or pain or tingling in your genitals or recurrent saddle sores, or you're reliant on things like 2 chamois or tons of chamois cream, this means you're on the wrong saddle or it's in the wrong position or both, and you need to solve the problem. And you need to be relentless about protecting your own health, the health of your own pelvic floor, because pelvic floor health will impact global health. And if you don't have health, you got nothing. So I'm telling you, do not tolerate a discomfort in the saddle or an uncomfortable saddle. It's amazing to me how many times people come in and they say, I'll ask my clients, rate this saddle 1 to 10, and they'll say, oh, 8.5, 9. And then we go through this process of testing saddles just out of curiosity. I try to give them an open mind, and maybe I'm happy to be wrong. If someone has a 9 or 9.5 saddle and we test 12 saddles and they're still, their original one is good, then great. I'm happy. I'm not here to sell people saddles. I'm here to optimize things for you. That said, so many times people come in and tell me they're at 8.5 or a 9, and I put them on a different saddle and their head explodes. and they realize they've been tolerating a 6 because of this belief system that you have to accommodate discomfort as part of a success in sport or a part of being a successful sportsman or sportswoman. And you do have to tolerate discomfort, but the type of discomfort is very important. We have to distill which comfort we are tolerating. There are certain types that we should tolerate, and there are others that we should be absolutely intolerant of. So hopefully that's helpful and clarifying for you. I find that many of my clients, when I have this discussion with them, they have a sense of illumination and they start to see areas in their own lives where they are inadvertently tolerating discomfort and they realize that's not necessary. And one more thing I'll say, I hear this over and over again about how all cyclists have a belief system that they've got this high pain tolerance. This is bullshit. You know why? Here's why. It's bullshit because we all have a high pain tolerance when it's self-inflicted. When you can hit your own pain button, you can learn to be really good at it. What almost no one is good at is exogenously inflicted pain tolerance, right? That is pain that is brought on by someone else where you have no control over the duration or the intensity. You want proof of that? The next time you crash, go to the medical tent and have someone else scrub your wounds. This is like a real test of pain tolerance. If you can sit there stone cold Steve Austin and not twitch an eye muscle while someone else runs a metal brush over your freshly baconed leg wounds, then you've got a real tolerance to pain, perhaps. Maybe you're just masochistic, which is the same thing as having a good pain tolerance, I suppose. But most people fall to pieces in those types of scenarios, but they claim they have a good pain tolerance because they can throttle themselves into oblivion on some climb somewhere. This does not impress me. I'm not impressed by your pain tolerance if you can go up a climb fast. I've seen it a billion times. What impresses me in athletes is not pain tolerance or KJs, it's growth. It's if you can challenge yourself, truly look in your own shadow, and understand why you're doing something with authenticity. But I digress. So hopefully this was a helpful discussion of pelvic floor anatomy, a little dive into anatomy, and hopefully you have an understanding of why so many factors can influence saddle choice in cycling and why it can't be reduced to sit bone width. So the moral of the story is, please don't email me your sit bone width. I don't care. The answer is try a bunch of saddles back to back, see how they feel, tell me what you feel. We can work through it and figure out what's going to be the best fit for you. That's all I got for today. Thank you for watching and listening. If you like this video and you feel like you know someone who would benefit from it, please share it. If you think that I'm doing good work, then hit the click and subscribe. Kind of pains me to say that a little bit, but this is how we get the word out to people whom we care about. That's my message. If you think someone else would benefit from this, then share the love. That's what I got. Thank you for listening. As always, and watching. Think consciously, pedal intuitively, and act with intention. I just butchered my own tagline. There you go. That's what you got. Thanks.